My guest this week, Lisa Opie, is very much the queen of the screens. Level 1 of Lisa's career was in the theatre, and she soon progressed to Level 2 in broadcasting at BSB, Flextech and Channel 5. Level 3 took her to production at the BBC before she hit boss level at video game studio Ubisoft. Lisa talks about the freedom to innovate in multi-channel TV, the joys and challenges of public service broadcasting, the power of the BBC brand, and the innovative storytelling techniques in the video games world. It's in the pod. Enjoy. Hi Lisa, welcome to the pod.
Thank you. Hi Danny.
So good to have you on board. I always like to start with a fun question, but before that, I think for the purpose of this interview, I think it's really important to remind you and the listeners that when it comes to the answers, everything is permitted and nothing is true. So with that in mind, and I'm hoping that lots of people will get that reference, if a Lisa Opie character was created for a video game, which game would you choose and why? And what would your character do?
That is such a difficult question because there is such an enormous wealth of creativity in video games that I didn't know about until very recently, as you probably know. So I'm not sure I'm going to do the sector the greatest amount of justice here. But I'd have to say it would be one of my favourite games and is Overcooked, which I'm sure many people have played. But for me, it's kind of like really evocative of a time when we were in lockdown and we played Overcooked with the family all the time. And anyway, there was something about it that sort of rang true to me. I'm very busy, as everybody who knows me will know. So the kind of being in a very fraught and busy kitchen and having to deliver to time and on order whilst there's chaos all around you sort of resonated a lot. So I'd definitely be in a cooking game and I'd be in a kitchen and turning out amazing dishes, obviously.
Very good. In your early days, you had really a performing background, and I guess it must have been a love of performance that took you to the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama and later Indiana University Theatre School. Was performing your big passion when you were younger?
So it's really weird. I don't know why it was a passion. I was a dinner lady, and my dad was a PE teacher in a big comprehensive school in Cornwall. There isn't a great deal of theatre in Cornwall. There's the Minack and a few other things, but not much. So I don't really know where it came from. But I think I went to the pantomime as a child and thought, this is really good fun. I quite like the idea of dressing up for a living. And so, yes, I definitely developed a passion for the theatre, and I was in the Cornish Youth Theatre as a child, which I really, really enjoyed, and then eventually decided with my parents sort of ringing in my ears saying you should do something sensible and practical and you do need a degree, when I was saying I'm just going to go to theatre school. And so eventually made the decision to go to the Welsh College of Music and Drama, which was brilliant. My dad, who sadly passed away quite a lot of years ago, he had 3 daughters. Always thought he'd wanted a son. I think when I was born, he was heard to say that it was another bloody girl. But actually, he was the most supportive father ever. And he definitely encouraged all 3 of us to follow our dreams. So, yes, they were really supportive, although just a little bit practical at times, which was a good thing. That's how I ended up in the theatre.
And were you a big TV fan? And I guess then the follow-up question is, having started in the theatre, how did you make your move into the TV business?
TV played a big part in our lives. And of course, TV was a shared pastime then. You all sat together in front of the telly. I liked, I'll never forget as a child watching Poldark with awful Cornish accents and my dad and Hill Street Blues and all of those kinds of things. I'm aging myself now, obviously. But yes, I worked in the theatre for about, 5 or 6 years and had the best time ever. But by accident, found myself working in radio. Somebody approached me in Radio Wales, BBC Radio Wales, because they were looking for a researcher on a specific project. And I'd been working in that area and had some interest in that area. So I ended up working in radio. That was my first step out of theatre. And I really, really loved it. I'd done a lot of community theatre, quite a lot of musical theatre, and all of it has been brilliant. But the joy of radio is that actually you can do the whole thing yourself. I just loved turning up with my recorder and recording interviews and then editing them myself and then presenting them and doing packages and then full-length programs in radio. So I really loved it. And there's no ego in radio. But then obviously I moved on to telly. So the move from there was I spent, I don't know, about 3 years working in radio and then moved into multi-channel television. So I went to work with a company called BSB, which was eventually acquired by Sky to become BSkyB. And I worked in the promotions department. So I both kind of made and presented promos. That was my first foray into television.
And then on to Flextech, which was a pioneer in satellite television and multi-channel television, although multi-channel television was in a lot fewer homes in the late 90s and early 2000s. Was that a blessing and a curse in that you had more freedom to innovate with the schedule and output, but more restrictive budgets because the scale was that much smaller?
It was a really brilliant time creatively. I think it was just fantastic. So you're absolutely right. You had the ability and the freedom to be highly creative because to a certain extent, unlike in public service television, you weren't sort of likely to end up in the Daily Mail. You were not as visible to so many people. So that gave you a creative latitude that I think you don't get everywhere, or you didn't get in sort of traditional broadcast television at the time. So it was a place of real creative freedom. And actually, I'd argue that some of the constraints made you even more creative than you might otherwise have been. It meant that we had a predominantly acquired lineup of content because producing content was really expensive and obviously not guaranteed to succeed. So acquiring content was the obvious and logical thing to do and made the most sense from a financial perspective. But it meant that we were really, really clear and passionate about how we positioned channels, how we targeted specific audiences, the most valuable audiences that we could find. So we were really, really imaginative and innovative when it came to promotions, breaks, branding, trailers, all of the ancillary things that sat around the content. I think we were really imaginative with. So, I mean, I worked on many old channels, some of which don't even exist anymore, but Living TV, for example, had for quite a long time been a housewives channel, and there was a real need to reinvent it because we needed to be more relevant and more dynamic with younger audiences, and we needed to improve the advertising revenue that we could collect. So repositioning that channel through a combination of things, positioning, the way we talk to audiences, the content that we acquired, I think was a really exciting thing to do. And we did it really successfully. That's the other thing. You could kind of move mountains much more easily because you could reposition things more effectively, much more quickly in that market. We had fresh and new approaches to brands rather than sort of decades of legacy to bring along with us. So it absolutely was a really creative period.
And you mentioned acquired programming, and inevitably they were vital to the channels. And some amazing standout shows, Grey's Anatomy, CSI, and formats like Next Top Model and Living, for example. I mean, these are the biggest shows of the last generation of television, really, and we're all on your channels. So as someone who came from a performing and perhaps creative background, how did you find negotiating with all of those terrible studio executives who are so tough, obviously present company excluded?
Obviously, you were always charming. I know, I look back at that array of content and it's mind-blowing, Charmed, and then on Trouble, because we had a teen channel called Trouble, which I was so proud of, Saved by the Bell, all of those real California Dreams, all of those classics that everybody remembers. And it was really fascinating. I used to love that part of the job. And it wasn't always easy because we didn't always have the deepest pockets. I suppose we were advantaged slightly in that most terrestrial broadcasters only had a limited number of slots for acquired content. So there was always slightly more content on the market than there were homes for it to go to. So that undoubtedly helped us. We also had a really good eye, which I think really paid off. We were very clear about our target audiences, really prided ourselves on knowing who they were and what they liked. We had very young, enthusiastic teams who were passionate about our channels. And we really kept an eye on the market and what was coming up and knew what was going to appear at the LA screenings in any given year. So we really watched the market and we'd plan ruthlessly about which titles we thought we wanted and what we would pay for them. And it was always a challenge negotiating those things. These deals would be really complex and long, negotiating for Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, for example, those big titles. And there were some that we didn't manage to get, obviously. Somebody else would win over us. But I always really enjoyed that market. There was always great content to choose. You were always spoiled for choice. There was so much innovation. I remember going to the LA screenings and watching the first ever Friends and the first ever ER and just being blown away about how we didn't get either of those. They went to Channel 4, obviously. And I remember sitting there with people from other broadcasters, we're not whispering to each other because you wouldn't want anybody else what you were going to go for. But we really found that we had a reputation, I think, amongst people who were selling TV programs for being really good with the content. So we were really chuffed. We treated the content with a great deal of respect in the way that we scheduled it, in the way that we promoted it, in the way that we treated the people who'd made it and appeared in it. These were our primary output. We really valued it. So I think we had that as something that sat on our side when we came to doing the deals. So to a certain extent, a loyal and loving home for a long period of time with lots of growth potential could at times be more appealing than a short-term home that might not take the second season and was always going to relegate a programme to a 10 o'clock slot rather than a 9. So we'd had to negotiate hard, and I think we were pretty good at it. And I personally enjoy that part of, I think I probably have quite a strong commercial streak that kept me going in those things.
In 2007, you moved to UK terrestrial broadcaster Channel 5 as managing director. What was the brief and how did you find the transition from multi-channel TV to terrestrial public service broadcasting, which you kind of referenced earlier? There is a difference in the lens and the microscope.
It was very different, no doubt about it. It was a very different challenge. And one, when I look back with hindsight, that I might have gone into thinking that some of the solutions I'd had from earlier in my career were going to be the same solutions for that part of my career. And they probably weren't. And I learned a lot through the process. The visibility was undoubtedly the first thing that was really striking. Having a public service remit, so it not simply being about actually what the audience wants most. It was also about if I filled the quota, or if I had too many repeats, is it the right mix of originations? Where does the news fit with that? There were many challenges that made the task more complex, and there was always a lot more people with an opinion about what you did and the decisions you made. So that was undoubtedly a big surprise and a big shift. And it was an interesting time, I think. It was an interesting time for Channel 5, still owned by RTL at that time. It's in a good shape now, I'd argue, and I think the content that it provides, it's found its voice, it's found its home, and I think it's consistent and clear in the way it positions itself. I think over time that's been a challenge to be the smallest terrestrial broadcaster, sort of squeezed between some very successful at the time multi-channel channels, well-funded with a lot more freedom, and other terrestrial competitors with an awful lot more budget. It was a difficult place to be in the middle. So I think, undoubtedly it was tough. It was a hard time. And it not helped by the fact, as I said, you'd find yourself with a lot of budget tied up in existing commitments and not a great deal of latitude and freedom to play around on the edges. And of course, we bought Neighbours, which was really good and a game changer at the time and really, really important. We had some good acquisition successes, Prison Break for one, that we acquired at the time, which was really brilliant. So I think we did things that were innovative, that were exciting. We had two extra channels, digital channels that we offered alongside it, which was brilliant to put together and finding their feet. So we had the US channel as well as a sort of much younger skewing channel, which worked really well. But it wasn't without its challenges, I don't think. And also, it was nearing 2008, and the market was challenging, full stop. It was a difficult time, I think, in TV.
And yeah, I think it's easy to forget that there was a kind of cataclysmic destruction almost of the advertising business. And I guess for you, that would have been a slightly different experience in the sense that you come from multi-channel TV where you had two revenue streams, dual revenue streams, and then suddenly you're very exposed in that role and in that position in the market. And a big challenge for you to have to deal with that.
I think that it was easy to forget the value of having two revenue streams, exactly as you say. It provided a buffer and it underpinned a lot of our business in cable and satellite. And we also had a whole group of channels. So Flextech had been the largest providers of channels into the market. I can't remember how many we have, but over 20, and represented UK TV. So across that portfolio, you can achieve a great deal of balance. You have one channel that targets one really clear demographic that the advertising market is keen to get. And then you have another channel that is targeting a different demographic, and being able to play those things and deliver really efficiently on your advertising targets really was useful to have. And of course, as I said, underpinned by subscription revenue. To be in an entirely advertiser-funded channel without, at the time, a sort of fat library of content that sat behind it, it didn't have an enormous archive of content that sat there either, was difficult, was, I think, a challenge, undoubtedly.
You then became a gamekeeper turned poacher when you moved to production company 24. And other people who've made that transition have talked about the move from being a buyer to a producer and seller. And how did you find that? It'd be interesting to get your perspective on making the move over, and specifically in the creation of content for digital distribution and working closely with brands, which I think was very much part of that role.
So it was a brilliant move, absolutely brilliant. And 24 were a great company to work for. I probably learnt pretty much everything I know about production from Mel Leach, who is not only probably the best saleswoman I've ever met when it comes to pitching programs, she's also really astute and really savvy and highly creative. So I loved working with her, and I learnt an immense amount from her. So they were a brilliant company to work with, really innovative, not a production company like many others. I mean, they too diversified their revenue, hence my role within them. But they were really, really innovative, always looking for fresh and new opportunities. But I learned from Mel about all of the basics, really, how much to have in development, how much effort and time and energy to put into developing new ideas, what a balanced pipeline looks like creatively, how to make sure that you're pitching appropriately, that you're killing something off quickly if it's not working, that you're not flogging a dead horse, how to make sure that you make a margin in production, which at times can be really bloody challenging, how to have an eye on the things that were going to last for a long period of time and not sort of be gone in a flash, how to think about longevity and balance that with a short-term need and a trend. So all of those things I think I found really, really fascinating, and I learned a huge amount. I also worked, whilst I was there, in a real departure. So having been very much in the land of television, I moved into this role that really had a very broad brief. So I worked with brands. So we had a whole load of brands that we had long running relationships with, from Audi to GlaxoSmithKline and VW, for whom we would make digital assets. So we would either run their live events digitally for them in the days before people had even thought of Teams, when this was quite a novel thing to do. We would create content for them. We would create websites for them, and we would make branded content. So things that ended up on television broadcast airtime. So it was a really broad array of things that we made and initiatives that we had in place. I also oversaw a team that created the media playout platform for the European Parliament, so it was the first time I had looked after, managed a group of people who worked in programming. So that was a useful insight that I didn't use for a few years to come, but was definitely useful. And actually, the selling thing, I really enjoyed. I really liked. I liked the pleasure of bringing together a proposal in its entirety, actually. The creative process of bringing together a pitch, the rigor that needed to sit underneath it in terms of how you could deliver this, not to promise something you couldn't then deliver, because some of us have done that a few times. And the actual pitching of the content, I really, really enjoyed. Plus the sort of the feeling of pleasure when you actually manage to sell it. So I found that transition not a difficult one, the moving into selling at all.
Very good. It's a noble profession.
It is.
In 2012, you moved to the BBC as Controller of Business Knowledge and Daytime before joining BBC Studios, initially as Managing Director Factual and subsequently Managing Director of BBC Studios Production. You'd had exposure, I guess, to the BBC in your Flextech UK TV days, but can anything really prepare you for the scale, prestige and influence of the BBC?
So it was an amazing thing to do, and I was really quite surprised when I got the job. I was really surprised, actually. I suppose I'd never seen myself as being a very BBC kind of person. I, like most people, was slightly in awe of the organisation. It's an enormous brand, has been an enormous brand in my life since the day I was born. So it was quite a surprise to find myself there. I went to a comprehensive school. I didn't go to Oxbridge, a posh university. I went to drama school, did a degree, and I'd worked in commercial television. I'd worked in multi-channel television, and I worked with brands. So it was quite weird to find myself working in public service. And it was incredibly exciting. I'd worked in BBC Radio Well, so I had worked at the BBC a decade or so previously, but it was a very different view, I think, of the BBC. It was to go to Television Centre. It was open for my first kind of 3 months at the BBC. I worked at Television Centre. It was like, I couldn't believe it. I thought I had kind of, I don't know what had happened. I was having a dream. So, and then I moved over to the new building, to New Broadcasting House, but it was still just awesome and really, really exciting. But then it's also quite complicated as an organisation. It's not the simplest to navigate at times, but it's a very large, very impressive organisation. And for the first sort of 6 months, trying to understand how it worked, how it operated, was quite a challenge. So it was a big eye-opener joining the BBC.
You led the charge at BBC Studios into commissions from non-BBC outlets such as other UK PSBs like ITV and Channel 4 and global services like Apple and Discovery. How significant is that BBC business card as a mark of quality when you're out pitching shows?
So, you can't underestimate how valuable this is. So when I first arrived at the BBC, I was given a role that had the most, a controller of business knowledge and daytime, I think it was. People would say to me, what on earth does that mean? My mother kind of went, what is that job? And it would take me a little bit to explain it. But I was originally brought in so that the commissioning teams looked more holistically at the value of the IP that they were commissioning across the board. So I was part of the thinking and part of the team that came together to think about the future of BBC production. And it was a time when BBC production was beginning to decline in the mix. And what was happening was that you'd end up with creative teams, production teams internally only able to make programs for the BBC. So when you had a brilliant idea, if they didn't want it on a BBC channel, there was nowhere to take it. And that had a real impact as a business. It felt more creatively exciting to be on the outside of BBC production than to be in it. And commissioners could take their pick and buy from any number of independents. And so it felt as if we had one arm tied behind our back in many, many ways. So a lot of thinking went into, what is the future for BBC production and how do we make it grow going forward? Because it brings inordinate value in terms of IP back into the BBC. So the decision was made to commercialise the BBC to BBC Studios production. And it was back in, 2019, I think. And so I was leading the factual teams. I was really, really lucky. So within the factual teams was the natural history unit, the science unit. I had daytime and features. I had documentaries. I had this really broad array of specialist factual and factual content of world-class quality. I also then, we launched commercially in the April. I also had the benefit of Blue Planet 2 launching in the spring. So there was literally at this time pretty much no one I couldn't ring up and say, hi, we're the people who made Blue Planet 2. Do you think we could have a meeting with you about a potential commission? And I think, we were recognised the world over for being amazing at making programming, at making content. So the BBC brand undoubtedly had weight and had clout in the market, which was really good. The balancing act for us as an organisation was to think about how do we organise ourselves to make the most of that opportunity? How do we make sure that we're pitching the right things? People came and still have a real passion for the integrity of what they produce and make. And one of the things in that transition from public service into the commercial world, one of the things that was clearest above all else was that our public service purpose was an incredibly important part of our brand. It was also a key kind of pillar of our commercial opportunity, that actually we needed to continue to be known for rigor, for authenticity, for high quality creativity. If we lost that, then we really didn't have anything that set us apart, I don't think. So we did a lot of thinking about how we positioned ourselves in the market. What was the opportunity? Who should we pitch to? What would we take to the market? And actually, it was an amazingly successful period with the factual teams, and an incredible honour to work with people, the likes of Mike Gunton and Andrew Cohen, Julian Hector, Johnny Keeling, who now runs the NHU, to work with people who had such skill, such craft, and sort of work with them to go out to the market and begin to pitch and make and create shows for different customers. So yes, we successfully pitched to Apple and to Discovery and to Channel 4, and it was an incredibly exciting time. It was really good.
In August 2021, you became managing director of Ubisoft, Leamington and Reflections, two video game studios at the cutting edge of development in the sector. When you were first approached for the role, what was your initial reaction? And how has your experience of the video games business been compared to what you thought when you went into it in the first place?
So I'd kind of gone from doing the BBC Studios factual role to then becoming sort of MD over BBC Studios, all of BBC Studios output, so drama and fact ent and entertainment, etc. So I'd taken on a broader role. And then pretty quickly after that, COVID happened, and I spent a lot of time working out what production protocols would be for, in light of social distancing, and working across with other broadcasters, finding ways in which we were going to put the protocols in place to continue to be able to make programs, and dealing with insurance issues and working out of furloughing. And it was an incredibly intense and really challenging time. And then in January 21, I think I've been wrong on some of my dates, but this was definitely January 21. I got a call from somebody to say that there was a role at Ubisoft and would I be interested? And I kind of went, I don't know, but I mentioned it to my son, who is a gamer, and he went, yes, you'd be interested. What, really? So I was really surprised. I mean, my experience of video games runs to what I play on my mobile phone, which I don't say too loudly when I'm here, because women of my age all seem to play things on their mobile phones. It's nothing to be proud of. I really didn't know a great deal about video games before I started, but it was a really interesting challenge and a completely new and fresh challenge. 2 studios, one in Newcastle, one in Leamington Spa. So, 400 or so people, very creative, quite complex in terms of the things that they do, and a different world to the one that I had been in. So my son, in the process, wrote me a glossary of terms, which was really useful, so that by the time I came to have my interview with the CEO, I didn't make a complete and utter plonker of myself. So he explained what a PDE was and PvP and mechanical inertia and an engine, what that was. And he even did a very short paragraph about blockchain, which in my interview with Eve, who is the CEO, nearly got me into trouble because I, like an idiot, said something about blockchain. And he then came back with a very intelligent question. And I realized I could talk about blockchain for about 15 seconds. And then I'd run out of anything intelligent to say. So, but anyway, Rue, my son, filled in all the gaps and gave me a full-on course when I then got the job. Actually said, right, you need to play this, you need to play that. So of course I played Assassin's Creed. We played all sorts of games. Last of Us, we played Stray, which I really loved. So he gave me a sort of complete education of what I needed to know about video games. And it was a shock. It was a real shock. I had, probably informed by my mobile, I had a very narrow view of what creativity existed in the video games market. And I was completely and utterly stunned by the depth and breadth and the diversity of creativity that sits in the sector. I think it's so impressive. So yes, that's how I ended up here.
And how would you compare and contrast the creative process in the 2 businesses, TV and gaming?
There are undoubtedly similarities. It's a creative business, so and it's a creative business in a world that's evolving rapidly, and technology is having an impact. It's a business, that's made up of people who are artists and script writers and cameramen and audio engineers and all of the things. So many similarities to TV. I suppose the most striking change for me has been that, if you asked me to make a television program, I probably could. It would be a bit rubbish, but there's every section of it I understand and know. You set out at the beginning, and this is something we were so good at BBC Studios, thanks to Fiona Clark, amongst others, of being clear about what we would deliver, being really clear in the brief in the first place, plotting that out, locking that down, and then delivering and executing to the date that it's due to go on air. There is something so much more iterative about building video games. It's software development. It's highly complex in so many ways. We're dealing, this isn't a sort of passive linear experience. This is an experience where the viewer, the player, has agency. They determine what the game, the experience is going to be. You, therefore, have to think of that game, of that experience, on so many different sort of aspects than you would in a passive entertainment experience, and that's mind-blowing. So we use tools very differently to plot and understand how you build a core loop of entertainment that has replayability, that brings people back in, how you weave narrative into those features, how you create game. The other thing I think was, the prominence of gameplay. Narrative is incredibly important in video games, but almost equally important is the gameplay, the experience, what you do, how it feels, what you look like, how you move in the world, the scale of the world, your impact on the world. So it has a complexity to it that Of course, there is complexity in television making, and of course, there's innovation and technological breakthrough all of the time. But that sort of everyday complexity. I've just been for a walk around with the teams this morning, and they're just showing me some of the things they do, and they think at a level of detail that I wouldn't have even thought it was a thing. And then I find myself talking to somebody, and they go, "We've just done all of this. Like, this is extraordinary." And also just seeing a video game come to life is extraordinary. So we are making a new IP, which is so exciting. But to see it come from a few wireframes floating around a screen into something that is tangible and real and beautiful and a whole world that sits around it is an extraordinary thing to witness. It's really impressive.
Changing industry sectors at any time is hard. And I think especially at a senior level when expectations are very high and perhaps specifically so in an industry where female executives and staff have at times been characterized as facing particular barriers. How do you think you've navigated the transition and what experiences have you drawn on to lead in this new environment? And I imagine creating a very positive working environment for female team members and executives as part of the brief.
I have the most incredible teams here in the two studios who have, since the day I arrived, been so warm and welcoming. And I have sat here thinking, what do I know? They know so much more than me about what they do. And actually, that's a fascinating world to find yourself in at my age, when you've kind of like relied on having a heritage and deep understanding and knowledge of, I could tell you how a Channel 4 deal stacked up. There's so many. I had a degree of mastery in my previous roles that, of course, I don't have here. And I think the special thing about Ubisoft is that it is a very people-driven environment. So they clearly put a significant degree of trust in me as somebody who has not come from a video game production background. And I think that, maybe the value that I have brought has been precisely in creating cultures that are welcoming and inclusive, and where people feel confident and comfortable enough to do their very best work because they can be themselves. And so we put a lot in our two studios of effort into being a place where people want to come and work. We spend a lot of energy focused on people's well-being. We have won awards for our focus and approach to well-being. We run an amazing well-being scheme that I think when I look back at all the other places I've worked before, here we're more open and honest and are able to have conversations about mental health in a way that I've never been able to do in a previous organisation. So I think Ubisoft is definitely a place where people come first. That is our greatest asset, probably our only asset, and some very good IP that sits in the bank too, sort of in the archive. But that focus on making sure that we're a supportive and good employer, I think, is absolutely of primary importance.
What's the most important piece of advice anyone ever gave you, and what would be the best piece of advice that you think you would give the next generation?
I think the most important piece of advice I ever got given was by somebody back in the day in radio who just said, whatever you do, listen first. And I think it was kind of pertinent advice because I'm very energetic and quite passionate about what I do. And at times I don't, and I have been known not to listen as much as I could. And actually, by listening hard and really listening and hearing other people's views, other people's opinions, you learn so much. And actually, quite often what people say is not what they mean. And if you don't listen properly, you won't catch that. And I think that sort of curiosity has propelled me through everything. So even when my career has not gone on the way that I thought it would, and it's taken a weird turn, or it's sort of, oh, here I am, curiosity has kept me going. I love to learn. And so for me, it would be that it's listen. And I look at my last 2 years here at Ubisoft. I have learned more in the last 2 years than I have, at any other period of my life. And it's such a privilege to learn such a privilege. My advice to others going forward, and especially in creative careers, I think it would probably be to do the same. And also, don't ever think there's sort of just one route. And actually, there are so many different routes to be creative. And, you know, I lived for a long time thinking, feeling like an imposter. You know, I felt like an imposter when I first got to the BBC because I felt I didn't have an arts education and people would speak in a language that I didn't quite understand all of the time. You know, there are times at which I have felt that I didn't belong in an organization. But actually, when you submerge yourself, when you listen well, when you are perceptive to what's going on around you, you can usually find a route and find allies and find success and creativity in all sorts of different places. It doesn't have to be the sort of set route that everybody thinks. There is no proper career. There is what you enjoy, what you learn at, and what you find fun. And it's an incredible privilege to work in a creative industry. And one of the other things I tell myself a lot is, you know, we're making games, we're making toys. That's a privilege. So, and when I was in telly, it was a privilege to make television programs.
So I always like to finish with a fun question about media and people's media choices. So if you had to schedule a night of Lisa Opie programming, which three shows would you choose, and which non-Ubisoft game would you also encourage the audience to play? Because it's not really fair to pick one of your own.
So I suppose I would choose Planet Earth 3 because I'm very proud of, I mean, I didn't make Planet Earth 3, obviously, but I just think it's extraordinary. And I think it's important television. And I think it's innovative and beautiful and just extraordinary television. So that would be on my list. Great pottery throwdown. as a sort of light relief, because I like making pots and that is my time out. And I'm off to make pots and knives very soon. And I just love it. I love watching, throwing is a brilliant thing to do and I love watching it on the telly. And then my final TV programme would have to be The Last of Us, which was the amazing Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin collaboration that aired on HBO, which I just thought was incredible. And if you haven't watched it, do. But first off, you have to play the game. So my game would be The Last of Us 2. And I think it was that when my son Rue took me on my educational path through every game I needed to know and understand, and that some of them, this was one of them. And it was that game that I suddenly thought, oh my God, this is not what I was expecting of a video game. So creative, so brilliant, such an experience. And then to see it as a television program, because there have been many television programs made of video games and vice versa, but I think this was probably the most successful that I have ever seen. And it was just a great collaboration. And to watch a television program and recognize, oh, I played that in this, I recognize the scene, I've been in that band, was really extraordinary. Oh, and there's the fire alarm. Which is now stopped.
That's the beauty of live radio.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
What a great way to bring it back around to the beginning. So, well, Lisa, it's been fantastic to have you on the podcast. It's been fascinating and very entertaining. And it may be game over for this interview, but many congratulations on reaching boss level at Ubisoft. And I very much enjoyed being Luigi to your Mario.
Thank you, Danny. It was really good fun. Thanks very much.